Welcome to this video looking at how to contract in a career guidance interview. Contracting is a central stage that happens in a career guidance interview, and it's normally the first stage. Well, it has to be the first stage. In fact, not normally. It has to be the first stage that happens. Contracting, as described by this quote here from Edward Bourdain, is about collaboration. It's about setting up the rules that allows the patient and the therapist, talking in these terms, to collaborate by having an agreed upon contract. So the idea of contract is the idea that throughout the interview there is a psychological contract, is an agreement between the two parties that allows them to work effectively. That this kind of contract sets out the exchanges that happen throughout the interview. It isn't just like a written agreement, though in some contexts you might have a written agreement, but more importantly, it is the psychological agreement between the two parties about how they're going to work together. So what this is saying is the first thing you need to do in an interview is to establish this psychological agreement between the two parties that's going to allow them to effectively work together. Lots of research has shown that this stage, this psychological contract, is the most important thing, which has an impact on how effective a session is. Lots of research in psychology and counselling and in career guidance as well, that this contract, sometimes called this working alliance, is the most important thing. It doesn't matter how much knowledge you have, how complicated the techniques are, how good you are at working with various techniques. If you can't establish this contract with the person that you're working with, you're not going to be effective. That's kind of the claim here, which I would say is is definitely one that I would stand behind as well. So this contract is going to be one of the key cornerstones that allows us to work in a Rogerian way, that allows us to work in a way which is congruent with our client, which is going to be based around sort of the empathy that we want to show, and is going to sort of be a cornerstone for the unconditional positive regard that we're going to show them. So a contract is kind of is a key tool which will allow us to work in a Rogerian way, but also importantly, when we look to establish a contract, we're going to be using these ideas to do so. We're going to establish a contract in a way that shows congruence, about us being genuine and open and honest, not trying to trick people into something that they don't want to do. It's going to be about us wanting to build a relationship of empathy, sort of focused on what they want and seeing the world through their eyes. And it's going to be that contract is going to be based around UPR, about sort of unconditional positive regard. We're not going to we're not going to judge somebody around what they want from the session. Our role in a humanistic tradition, at least, is to work around what they want the session to be about. So yeah, contract has these two roles. It will allow us to work in a Rogerian way if we do it well, but also the way we establish it will be using Rogerian principles, these ideas of congruence, empathy, and UPR as set out here. So, going back to Edward Bourdain, who I think is really helpful about this, he sees a contract has been based around three principles. So a good contract should involve all three of these ideas. I would say that your contract is bound to come apart if you're not able to work around these three ideas. So he says the working alliance, that idea, which is very similar to what the idea which is a contract. The working alliance is a collaboration for change, for which I've identified three aspects. So collaboration for change, like we're aiming to collaborate, to work with somebody to bring about positive change in their life. Is around mutual agreements and understandings regarding the goals sought in the change process. So we're going to agree on what the session is going to be about. It's going to focus on the tasks of each of the partners. So what are the two people going to do in the session? If we're going to achieve a particular goal, what are you going to do as a professional, and what would you expect the person you're working with to do? And also the bonds between the partners necessary to sustain the process. So what sort of a relationship are we going to have? Are there going to be things that's going to guide that relationship? Maybe ethical things, but also maybe practical things as well. So we need to to have a contract, we need to have an agreement that covers all three of these things. Yeah, and go back to the same idea before about how important contracts are. I would say, in my experience of working with students and also in reflecting on my own practice, 9 times out of 10, when a session isn't as effective as it could be, it's because one of these three things at least hasn't been established properly. That you haven't established a clear goal, you haven't set out clear tasks, and you haven't developed these bonds between the partners in order to sustain the process. So. So what would we hope from this? So if we establish these three things, what we'd hope is we'd hope to create hope in the person that we're working with. We're going to hope to create hope in the person we're working with. That's what we want out of the contract, is that the person that we're working with has a sense of confidence that things could be better for them, that this is a place that they want to be, and that they are hopeful that the interaction is going to be positive for them. In order for that to be the case, we're going to want them to be able to develop some faith in us as professionals. So that's where hope comes from. It's confidence the person that they're working with is somebody that they can trust, and that the process that the professionals guiding them through is going to be beneficial to them. We're going to want their commitment to the process. We're going to ask things of them, and so we want some sort of a commitment from them. And ultimately, we want an expectation of benefit for them, that the process that we're going to go through is going to be of benefit to them. So yeah, all of these ideas, sort of filling out this idea of hope, particularly that sort of hope comes from a trust in you as a professional, that sort of faith in you as a professional. It comes from that they feel that they can be committed to the process and take action, and that all of this is going to lead to benefit. So that's what we want from the contract, is that they would come out of that contracting stage, however long it is, with a clear sense of hope in the process, faith in us as professionals, their commitment to the process, and ultimately an expectation that what we're going to do with them is going to lead to their benefit. So what would this look like in practice? This is my suggestion. It's sort of it's based on training that I've done previously and sort of my own sort of experiences. I don't think it's particularly novel, but I think there are 4 rough stages that you would go through in the contract. Now, I don't really want to say how long any of these would take, because that will vary between different contexts. But I would say that for a session to be both based around sort of like Rogerian principles, and for it to be effective, you do need to cover all 4 of these stages. Like, if you're not effectively doing these things, I think it's going to severely weaken whatever sort of one-to-one conversation you have afterwards. It's not about allotting time to them. I'm saying stage 1 should be 3 minutes and stage 2 should be 5 minutes, or stage 1 should be 10 minutes and stage 2 should be 17 minutes, or anything like that. You'll, in different contexts, you'll have different time constraints, and these things may have different you might be able to have to focus on these in different ways, or have to explore them in different ways. But your goal should be to establish all 4 of these things, and I think they kind of work in order. So yeah, opening dialogue, looking at terms and conditions, exploring goals, and then sort of discussing roles and tasks. So let's talk about these. So firstly, opening dialogue. Fundamentally, we want the person that we're working with to be doing talking in the session. We want to open them up to conversation. We're interested in their inner world, and the way that we're going to work around their inner world, how we're going to sort of collaborate with them and support them in bringing about change, is by understanding things from their perspective. That's vital from from a position of empathy. It's vital from a position of wanting to show unconditional positive regard. We need to hear from them. Well, they're not attending a lecture. They're not, ultimately, nobody in the session is focused around our opinions. And so for us to work effectively, we need to get them talking. So probably the first thing you want to do in the session is to get them talking. Now, this might happen when you collect them and as you walk over to the interview room, if they're coming from a lesson, or if you've met them in sort of like a waiting area and you're walking over to wherever the confidential conversation is going to take place. But you want to open up some dialogue. You want to get them talking. You want to set the expectation nice and early that they're going to do talking, but also that you can be trusted, and that them being open with you is going to be something worthwhile. So with this in mind, like you are probably going to develop various different strategies. I think this is very contextual on the sort of person that you're working with. Um, but I always think like you want some sort of like some softball questions that's going to get them talking. That's not, but is going to avoid them jumping into immediately wanting to discuss what they want from the session before you've been through some of the other stuff. So you want to get them talking, but in some ways you want to get them talking not about what you're going to discuss in the session. So sometimes somebody you will do a nice sort of "How are you today?" and they'll come in and go, "I'm fine. Could you check my CV?" And we want to try to avoid that in some ways because we haven't been through the other stages of the contract. We don't want to sort of immediately jump in there and dealing with whatever issues and concerns they've got. So sometimes you might want to ask some slightly broader, slightly more specific questions around how's the term going for you? Of like they've come out of a lesson, sort of asking them, what lesson have you just been in, and what have you been studying, or asking them what are sort of obvious broad questions, like sort of how's your weekend been, or if you've had like a like sort of a big sort of cultural event recently, like if you've just as I'm sort of recording this, we're sort of coming up to Halloween and bonfires night, and sort of on the slowly moving towards Christmas. You might sort of ask them about those sorts of things to try and get them speaking. You might have like there'll be sensitivities, things to avoid. But yeah, the ultimate aim of this stage is to get them talking. It doesn't necessarily need to be very long, but you kind of want to stick with this for long enough that you're kind of getting past sort of like sort of monosyllabic answers. You want to give them the expectation that they're going to do some talking. When people attend career sessions, they may come with the expectation that they're not going to do much talking. Maybe in like a school context, young people are used to the teacher taking a lead and controlling the session and being the one who really does the work in the session. And that they might have those sort of expectations of what's going to happen, that they're going to turn up and that you're going to tell them what to do and that you're going to produce lots of information that they need to remember. But it's not really, they're not going to do much talking. You kind of want to get out of that sort of expectation. Why? So sometimes like just giving you a bit of space, bit of prompting, maybe saying things like this session is your time. We're going to be focusing on what you think, but I'd just like to get to know you a bit and just hear a few things about you first. Like maybe sort of giving sort of trying to set up for them what you're trying to do. Like you would just before we get to the session, it just might be nice to get to know each other and have a bit of a conversation about how your week's going or something like that, just to set out some boundaries around why you're doing this. So this doesn't need to be going for ages, but you just want to get into a setting where it feels like you're having a conversation with them and they're talking and they're happy to share their views. Sometimes this may not work at all. Sometimes you may find that somebody's really sort of closed off from you. And so sort of probing and just trying to work harder at getting them working might be important. And sometimes if that's the case, it just sort of going back and making it clear why you want this, because sort of to get them going sort of thing. Saying things like, so this session is really going to be your time, so I'd just really like to hear from you. Do you want to just tell me a bit about how your week's going? Because yeah, this session is going to be really based around your views and your opinions. Just sometimes just telling them that there's an expectation that they're going to be talking. I mean, ultimately, if somebody doesn't want to talk, then you might have to adopt some different strategies. You might ultimately just think that you can't really behave in a Rogerian way with somebody that doesn't want to open up at all. And maybe they're just not ready for the interaction. Maybe it's not going to be beneficial for them at the moment. And then you're interested like a service level thing about why does this interaction have to happen today, or if they seem really closed, or maybe there are things going on in their life which means that they're just not ready for it. That they've come because they booked it, but something in their personal life has happened that means that they just don't want to have this conversation, or they're under obligation to do it and they're just not committed to it in any way themselves, and so they have no desire to talk to you. So sometimes you're just like, well, this interaction can't happen, so then you've got to make a decision about whether you can do things in a non-Rogerian way, which might be positive for them, or whether you actually just need to talk to them about how the session can't really take place until they're in a position where they can engage with it better. But that's the first stage, opening up dialogue. So secondly, we need to cover some terms and conditions. Like often when people think about contracting, they just mean this stage. So it's important just to hold all of these stages together. But terms and conditions is where we're going to cover important sort of building blocks around how we're going to work with our clients. So confidentiality, that's going to obviously that's going to cover the fact that we're not going to share information about the session with anybody else. We're going to work in a confidential way. If there are limits to that, like if you have to feedback information because of the contract you're working under, or if information about the session might be stored on a system that people have access to, or if you're recording this session as part of a course that you're doing, you might want to talk to them about the limits of confidentiality. But it's important that they understand what it is. You've got a choice here with confidentiality about whether you're just going to explain it, whether you're just going to say the session is confidential, obviously, and just expect them to know it, or whether you're going to maybe try and get their understanding about what confidentiality means. It's a technical term, not everybody would understand it, and so you might need to do some work around it to really establish it in the session. Secondly, impartiality. Obviously, in a Rogerian sense, you're there for the benefit of the person. So you want to be talking about that, saying, well, this isn't my time, this is your time, I'm here to help you. It's a time to really explicitly talk about some of those Rogerian principles with somebody. Not you go through them all in order, but you want to get them settled into the idea that you're there for them and for their benefit. This isn't for you, it's not about you hitting goals, it's not about something that you've got to achieve, but this session is ultimately for them, the client. You might want to cover things like how long the session is going to be. If there's like a time limit on it, like does it have to be 45 minutes and then you have to go into another interview or into another meeting? If there are time constraints, it was helpful to talk to people about that in advance. Notes: are you going to take them on what's going to happen with them? This comes back into confidentiality as well, but it's also just thinking about, well, are you keeping a record? If you're scribbling things down, well, what's going to happen with that information? What would they sometimes people may feel nervous about that. Would it be a good idea if they took notes? Do you want to maybe encourage them to take notes at this stage in the session? And then, what sort of setting is this happening? Maybe if it's happening in an online setting, there might be other things to discuss. You might want to discuss, is it helpful or not for people to have webcams on? You might want to ask them about whether anybody else is present in the interaction. Sometimes if somebody's got their webcam off, even if they do, you may be unaware that somebody else is listening in. Suddenly we go through the session and then suddenly somebody's partner, flatmate, parent suddenly interjects into the session, and suddenly you find that you're running a session with 3 different people, having conversations around, well, this is a private space, is anybody else with you, can anyone else hear our conversation, might be a helpful conversation to have in an online space. Now, there might be other sort of terms and conditions that we want to sort of to establish, but I think those are some obvious ones that you would most of the time be wanting to consider. Again, sometimes you'll get through these fairly quickly, and it's just about explaining them to people. Sometimes some of this information might be sent to people in advance, so they will have received an email that sets out how long the session is going to be, or might have sent sort of service level agreements around things like confidentiality and impartiality. But you want to establish these things. You want to make sure that that somebody knows the kind of like the terms and conditions they're going to be working through. Something to add in here is sometimes you might want to ask them about whether they have any terms and conditions, like anything that you should know about their expectations for the session. You might at this point want to possibly discuss things like disability or mental health or things like that. Like if you might want to raise, like, is there anything that's important for me to know about you before we start working together? So that if they are dyslexic, or if they if they have ADHD, or if they have a hidden disability, or if there's something important about them, like they've recently been bereaved, that they want to share with you, that they feel they've got the space to say that at the beginning of the session before you get going. People may not always disclose in that space. They may feel find some difficulty in doing so, but you might want to think about whether as part of your terms and conditions, whether you're going to give them space to disclose important stuff about them, as well as working through the ideas we've got here that you would that are coming from you, as it were. That's terms and conditions. Then goals. So this is really vital. Like, what's the session going to be about? Well, ultimately, focused on working around them. So what is the goal? I think when we think about goals, we kind of deal with this metaphor of the iceberg. Like, what is on the surface, what is first presented, is not always what's most significant, but it is ultimately the only thing that we can see. So think about opening up, like, well, what brings them here? Why have they like why are they in this interaction? Sometimes you may be clear, you may know about that anyway because you have to see your year 9 pupils at a particular point in time, or because this is part of a particular program for people who are unemployed, or any other range of reasons. So you may know something about what brings them here, but you still want to talk to them about, well, what does this session mean for them? This is a really important point to establish that this session is of benefit for them. Like, it's not a tick box exercise for you. It's not something that's being forced upon them, or at least if it is being forced upon them, then they have an opportunity to set the agenda for what's actually going to happen. So what brings them here? What do they want to get out of the session? But as part of that, you might want to have a bit of a conversation around that. You might want to co-construct, think of using a technical term, what the goal of the session is going to be. So is there something bigger going on? So if somebody turns up, let's think about a university careers service, they're finding a student and they turn up with their CV and say, oh, I'd like you to check my CV before I start applying for graduate jobs. Thinking, well, is this the most important thing that's happening? Or maybe have they even come with like a CV for you to check? But knowing actually they've got some bigger concerns, but they just think that what they do is they come with their CV, or that the CV is like a concrete thing to have a conversation about, but they've actually got some quite deep-seated nerves around their future, but they haven't got there yet in terms of wanting or being able to say that out loud. So sometimes having something, being able to create a conversation around what they first say can be helpful. Like if they come and say, can you check my CV before I start applying for jobs? You might say something like, really happy to do that, but I just wonder, do you want to have a wider conversation around what you're going to do when you finish your degree? Or just really want to have a conversation around that's the best use of our time. Do you have anything else you'd want to discuss? Because it may only take me 10 minutes to discuss that, and we've got 30 minutes as this session. So thinking about strategies you can use to open up a bigger conversation for them. Sometimes that might involve you actually talking to them about what else you could do. So saying like, oh, I'm very happy to check this CV. But other people in your situation before have found it helpful just to have a broader conversation around what they can do about their after they finish their degree. I wonder, have you ever had a conversation with somebody about how to make a decision for your future? Or saying, well, I actually use a particular technique, which is about people setting goals for their future. It's called Grow. Do you want me to talk to you about that in a bit more detail so you can understand if it might be of benefit to you now? So, what think you were saying? Like, so I see you're applying for jobs. I just wonder if you want to have a broader conversation around around what options there are and how you might choose between options. So think you would probably develop these strategies and you develop them in context. But what you want to do is to maybe set out some options so they can choose between them. And sometimes a session might involve a number of them. And sometimes you might want to say, well, actually, that's quite a lot. We've only got half an hour, 45 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, whatever it is here today. Which of these is most important to you? And we can always have a follow-up to discuss some of these other issues as well. So prioritizing and getting them to start to set out which is most important. Or you might want to say, can we put these in an order? Which of these do you think we need to decide on first? Maybe get them to have the idea that actually being clearer on their career aspirations might be more important as a first step than writing a CV, which logically comes after being clear around what sort of roles you're going to be applying for. So yes, so sometimes getting clarity on goals is about is about you getting to prioritize and work out, or them to work out what the logical order is of things. Ultimately, then, we want to be focused on what they want. We may be convinced that there are some deep-rooted problems that they've got around their confidence or around developing resilience, or that they're unable to sort of network properly, or don't know the importance of networking, or they just don't know how to make a decision. But if they're standing there saying, what I'd really want to talk about is how to apply for this particular postgraduate course and what I need to do to get into this particular profession, even if you think it's not helpful for them, remember that we're ultimately focusing on them and what they think is helpful. So we need to be focused on what they want. Sometimes you can open that up by showing that you will deal with the thing that they want, and maybe there's some more space to discuss some other things. So sometimes professionals can be very nervous about just giving people information. That's the thing that careers advisors talk about a lot. So we want to avoid just handing out information, even if it's what people want. But you want to avoid having an argument, and you want to avoid giving people the impression that they made a bad decision to come to you and ask for information. Sometimes you need to say that you will do what they want, but that maybe you can help in other ways as well, and to open up and broaden out that conversation. So yeah, really important to discuss goals. And then moving on to the final one of Bourdain's ideas. So we've talked about bonds through the first couple of stages, and then we obviously talked about goals here. Well, let's talk about tasks or maybe roles. So if you've set out the idea that you're going to talk to them about what the session could be focused around, what could they do when they finish their geography degree? What are they going to do after they've done their GCSEs, or now that they're unemployed, what sorts of roles they're going to apply for? Once you've got like a goal, well, how are the two of you going to work around that goal? So this idea of roles. So we've got a picture of Hamlet from some of you may be aware, comes from an English play by William Shakespeare. But this idea of playing a role. And thinking about like who sets the roles, whose roles are we dealing with here is really important for this stage. So what will who do? Or who will do what? Just reading the point there. You want to set out here expectations, because they may have very different expectations from you around what they're going to. Around what's going to happen. So you may say that you're going to have a conversation around what they can do with their degree. You may be thinking, well, ultimately they're going to decide that. I'm going to support them in decision making, and they're thinking, well, what's going to happen now is that they're going to give me a list of options, and I'm going to pick one. So this is the second point. Think about their expectations. They may have very different expectations around the session than you do, and so you want to talk about roles. They may think that you're going to do most of the talking. You may think that they're going to do most of the talking. If you don't have that conversation, things are going to come unstuck. Or they may think that you're going to have like an initial conversation and you're going to get some ideas in the head, and then there's going to be a point in the session where there's going to be a gear change, and suddenly you're going to go, aha, you have given me enough evidence and I have now worked out what you're going to do with your future. So they expect there's going to be some initial conversation, but ultimately you're going to tell them what to do. So having a conversation and clarifying roles might be really important. So you might want to say, so it's my belief that you're best placed to actually solve this problem for yourself. So I've got some experience about some good questions to ask, but what we're going to do in the session is I'm going to ask some questions to help you think through this problem. But ultimately, because this is your life and I want to treat you with respect, I'm going to help you to solve this problem yourself. Or you might say some things like, well, we're going to deal with a number of different topics. We're going to think about self-awareness. I'm going to ask you some questions around that. We're going to think about how you would research roles, and I'm going to ask you some questions again about what strategies you could take. And then if there's some information that might be helpful, then maybe I can point you towards some particular things. Does that sound helpful? Would you feel comfortable with all those things? Or are there any extra things that you would expect me to be doing, or that you would like to do in the session that we've not discussed? So yeah, you really want to be opening up a question around your expertise. Like in a Rogerian sense, your expertise is your ability to ask good questions that help them think about their problems. So you want to get this across in this section, making it clear to them that you're going to be asking them questions. Making it clear that these questions aren't there to catch them out. This is the idea of congruence, right? You're not aiming to trick them into something, but the questions are there so that the two of you together can understand what's happening, and so that you can ultimately help them bring things onto the surface so they can know what to do about them. So particularly with a younger client, or a client who's maybe come from a situation where they've been part of an institution, like they've been in prison, for example, or they've been dealing with the state through like a sort of a back to work scheme. You might want to make it clear that you're not there to catch them out, and they can't. You're not asking questions to trick them, but you're asking questions to help them think about things. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions. I'm going to mainly be asking questions here, but that's because I really want to know what you think about these things. I'm not here to judge your answers, but I find so often when I ask people questions, it helps them understand the problem for themselves and think through what they can do about it. So you might want to make it clear why you're asking questions. Are there any particular techniques that you're going to use? So you may always use a particular technique. You may always want to use like some of Savicas's ideas around role models and sort of delving into sort of patterns in people's past. You might want to talk about that. If you're going to use a card sort, if you're going to get them to draw a timeline, if you're going to encourage them to maybe do something artistic, like draw a picture, you might want to talk about this at this point, saying some things that I sometimes get people to do is a particular technique like this. Do you think this would be helpful? So that you're sort of so that you're getting them to understand the techniques you're using and what's expected of them and what you're going to do. Ultimately, yeah, sort of come back to this idea of a role again. We want them to remember it's their time, not yours. This isn't about you convincing them that you get to do what you want. It's not about getting their buy-in for you as a professional to show off. It's about genuinely having a good discussion about roles so that they can buy into the best way that you want to help them. Sometimes they might have ideas, like they might say things like, "I'd really just like you to tell me what I can do when I finish my degree," and you might sometimes be able to say, "I really want to help you with that problem, but I can't actually do that because I just don't know you well enough. But I have worked with lots of people in this situation before, and I find something that is helpful is if we have conversations around these topics, which is about me asking questions. So you might find ways to get them to buy in. But you really, in this section, you want them to surface their expectations for how you're going to work together, and you want to introduce some new ideas and together discuss a way of effectively working. Power dynamics are really important here. So it's not about you just tricking somebody into what you want to do anyway. It's genuinely setting out what roles are going to look like in the session. And sometimes they may ask you for particular things, like, I would like you to give me information on what roles are popular in this area, or what people who have studied my particular degree often go to, or I really want to know about what wages are in this part of town, or what sectors are going out of fashion. And you may not think those things are particularly helpful yourself, but it's important to commit to the person around how they want to use their time. So that's what we want to do, is we want to establish the contract, which is based around those things, about developing a bond, about having a clear set of tasks in mind and a shared goal. It's also worth to say that as the session goes on, you may want to revisit this. So there may be times when you think, actually, what we could do now is we could do with using this task. And so you kind of then do like a micro adjustment of the contract. You don't always tell them that's what's happening, but you might sort of say, maybe I think something helpful for us to do now would be this. This is why we're going to do it. This is why it would be helpful, and just get them bought into a task before you start using it and using it as part of a session. Or sometimes it may be obvious that the goal that you set out for isn't really what they want to be discussing. And so sometimes you want to feed that back and just give them a chance to redirect the session. So you might say, well, when you came in here today, we were talking about applying for roles after you finish going to school. But actually, I just think we've really been discussing quite a lot of stuff to do with your parents and how you're dealing with that relationship around your parents' expectations. I wonder, shall we focus on that for the rest of the session, and then maybe we can come back and have another session to discuss anything else we don't get onto. So if you feel the session is going in a different way, so rediscussing, sort of clarifying what the goals can be, is really important. We want to see the contract as something which is dynamic and ongoing, and really sort of helps them to establish what they want to get out of the session. But it should always be, if you feel there's a shift in that throughout the session, you want to clarify that and sort of go back to first principles. Okay, hopefully you've found that useful. Have you got an idea about what some of the main principles are around a contract and what we're aiming to do in this part of the session? Obviously, this may be very contextual for different settings, and you may want to put different things in there on the basis of the practitioner that you are. But hopefully you can see the basic moving parts that we're trying to do in this first stage of the session.